A racist cop thought his badge made him untouchable. But when he arrested a decorated Black Army soldier, a man who defended the very freedoms he trampled, it shattered everything he believed. This gripping story of power, racism, and justice will leave you speechless. Stay until the end for a revelation that changes everything. It was a sweltering summer afternoon when Officer Patrick Daniels pulled his cruiser into the dusty parking lot of a roadside diner just outside the small town of Braxton. The sun beat down mercilessly, and the air shimmered with heat waves. Inside his car, Daniels adjusted his sunglasses and smirked as he caught sight of a black man sitting calmly at one of the picnic tables near the edge of the lot. The man wore a simple white t-shirt and faded jeans, his broad shoulders and upright posture suggesting strength and discipline. He sat quietly, sipping a bottle of water and scrolling through his phone. Beside him, a green duffel bag rested on the table, its military patches faint but unmistakable. Daniels didn't see a soldier. He didn't see a man who had served his country with honor. What he saw was an opportunity to flex his authority. Pulling the cruiser into a spot, Daniels stepped out, his boots crunching against the gravel. He adjusted his belt and sauntered over, his posture radiating arrogance. "Hey you," he barked, loud enough to turn heads. "What are you doing out here?" The man, whose name was James Carter, glanced up, confused but calm. "Just waiting for a ride, officer," he replied, his voice steady. Daniels crossed his arms, his expression hardening. "You got ID on you?" he demanded. James furrowed his brow. "Is there a problem, officer?" Daniels stepped closer, his tone sharp. "I asked you a question. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." People in the diner turned to watch, their murmurs rising like a low hum. James slowly reached into his pocket and handed over his military ID, keeping his movements deliberate to avoid any misunderstandings. Daniels snatched it without so much as a glance at the name or rank printed on it. Instead, he focused on the duffel bag. "What's in the bag?" Daniels asked, his tone dripping with suspicion. James's jaw tightened, but he remained composed. "Clothes, personal items. I'm traveling home after deployment," Daniels sneered. "Traveling home? Doesn't look like you're going anywhere. Stand up." The heat pressed down on James, but it was nothing compared to the simmering indignation rising within him. He had faced enemies in combat zones, but this was a different kind of battle. Slowly, he stood, towering over Daniels by a good 3 inches. Daniels didn't flinch. If anything, the height difference seemed to fuel his determination to assert control. He grabbed James by the arm, his grip unnecessarily tight. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back." James froze. "What's this about?" he asked, his voice steady but laced with disbelief. Daniels smirked. "You're being detained. Resisting will only make it worse." The crowd at the diner gasped. Someone whispered. "He didn't do anything." James took a deep breath. "I'm not resisting," he said firmly, as Daniels pulled out his handcuffs. The cold metal bit into James's wrists as the cuffs snapped shut. Daniels led him to the cruiser, ignoring the murmurs and shaking heads around them. He opened the door and shoved James inside, the sound of the door slamming echoing across the lot. Back in the driver's seat, Daniels radioed in. "Suspect detained," he said smugly, leaving out any mention of what, if anything, James was suspected of. In the back seat, James stared out the window, his mind racing. This wasn't the first time he had faced prejudice, but it was the first time it had come with handcuffs. His hands, which had once carried fallen comrades off the battlefield, now sat shackled behind him. As the cruiser pulled away, leaving a cloud of dust in its wake, the truth was clear to James. This wasn't about justice. It wasn't about law and order. It was about power, and the abuse of it. But what Daniels didn't know was that his actions had set something in motion, something that would change both of their lives forever. The ride to the precinct was silent. Except for the hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the police radio, James sat motionless in the back seat, his mind drifting to memories he'd rather forget. Images of sandstorms, the deafening roar of helicopters, and the weight of fallen comrades filled his thoughts. His service in the army had been grueling, but he had always held on to one belief. He was fighting for justice, for freedom, for a better world. Now, handcuffed in the backseat of a police car for no reason other than the color of his skin. That belief felt like a cruel joke. Daniels glanced at James in the rearview mirror, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. So, what were you really doing out there? Waiting for your dealer? Scoping out the place? James didn't respond. He knew men like Daniels. Nothing he said would matter. Instead, he stared out the window, his jaw clenched, thinking about his late father's words. Hold your head high, son. No one can take your dignity unless you let them. As they pulled into the precinct, the reality of his situation hit James like a punch to the gut. Officers milling about the parking lot paused to stare as Daniels roughly pulled James out of the car. The clink of the cuffs and Daniels' firm grip on his arm felt like chains, but James walked tall, his shoulders square, his eyes forward. Inside the station, the fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow on the grey walls. Daniels pushed James toward the booking desk, where another officer, a younger man named Officer Reynolds, raised an eyebrow. "What's this about?" Reynolds asked, glancing at James and then at Daniels. "Loitering. Suspicious behavior," Daniels replied with a shrug, as if that explained everything. Reynolds frowned. "Suspicious behavior? Did he resist?" Daniels scoffed. "Nah, but you never know with these types." James's eyes narrowed. He locked eyes with Reynolds, who shifted uncomfortably under his steady gaze. "I need to make a phone call," James said, his voice calm but firm. Daniels snorted. "Sure, after we're done here." "No," James replied, his tone like steel. "I have rights. I need to call my commanding officer." Daniels froze for a moment, the words hanging in the air. "Commanding officer?" he repeated, a hint of doubt creeping into his voice. James leaned slightly forward, his presence commanding even with his wrists bound. "That's right. I'm Sergeant James Carter, United States Army. And you've made a serious mistake." Reynolds stiffened, his eyes darting between Daniels and James. "Wait. Army. Daniels, did you check his ID?" Daniels waved him off. "Yeah, he had some fake military card. Probably bought it online." James let out a slow, deliberate breath, his patience wearing thin. "That ID wasn't fake. It's issued by the Department of Defense. I've served 3 deployments. I've led men into battle, and I've earned every stripe on my uniform." Reynolds stepped back, visibly unsettled. "Daniels, if he's telling the truth," Daniels cut him off. "Relax. I know his type. Always trying to play the system." Before the conversation could continue, the sound of heavy boots echoed down the hall. A tall man in a sharply pressed suit strode in, his face stern and unreadable. Captain Miller, the precinct's commanding officer, had been alerted by a desk clerk about the unusual arrest. "Daniels, what's going on here?" Miller demanded, his eyes sweeping over the scene. Daniels straightened, trying to mask his arrogance with feigned confidence. "Caught this guy loitering and acting suspicious near the diner. Found him with a bag and a fake military ID." Miller's sharp eyes turned to James. "Fake ID, huh?" James met his gaze without flinching. "Sir, my name is Sergeant James Carter. I've served 12 years in the Army. My ID is real. And this man," he motioned toward Daniels with a tilt of his head, "didn't bother to verify it before throwing me in cuffs." Miller's face darkened. He motioned to Reynolds. "Check the ID, now." Reynolds quickly retrieved James's ID from Daniels, his hands shaking slightly. A moment later he looked up, his face pale. "It's real," he said quietly, handing it to Miller. The room fell silent. Miller's jaw tightened as he turned to Daniels. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" he said, his voice low but furious. Daniels stammered. I thought he was—" "You thought." Miller cut him off sharply. "That's the problem. You didn't look. You didn't ask. You assumed. And now we have a decorated soldier, someone who's given more to this country than most of us, sitting here in handcuffs like a criminal." James remained silent, his expression unreadable. Inside, though, a storm of emotions raged. Anger, humiliation, but also a grim satisfaction. Miller turned to James, his voice softer. "Sergeant Carter, I deeply apologize for this. You'll be released immediately, and I'll make sure this situation is addressed." James nodded but didn't speak. He didn't need to. The room was heavy with the weight of what had just unfolded. As Reynolds unlocked the cuffs, James rubbed his wrists, his gaze fixed on Daniels. "This isn't over," he said quietly, his voice steady. Daniels swallowed hard, his bravado crumbling. He had no idea how right James was. James Carter stepped out of the precinct into the warm afternoon sun, but the heat outside felt less suffocating than the tension he had left behind. He could still feel the weight of the handcuffs on his wrists, even though they were gone now. He glanced down at the faint red marks on his skin, a reminder not of weakness, but of the injustice he had just endured. Pulling out his phone, he made a quick call. The familiar voice of Major Allen, his commanding officer, answered almost immediately. "Sergeant Carter, what's going on?" the major asked, his voice calm but laced with concern. "Sir, I've just been released from custody after being unlawfully detained by a local police officer," James said evenly. "I'll explain everything, but I want to make it clear. This isn't staying quiet." There was a pause on the line before the major replied. "Understood. Do what you need to do, Sergeant. Keep me informed. We've got your back." James hung up, his jaw tightening with resolve. He wasn't just going to walk away from this. He owed it to himself, his brothers and sisters in uniform, and the countless others who had faced similar treatment without the means to fight back. Inside the precinct, Captain Miller stood in his office, staring at Daniels with an expression that could have melted steel. Daniels shifted uncomfortably under the weight of his superior's gaze, his usual arrogance replaced by a nervous silence. "Do you have any idea how badly you've screwed up?" Miller said, his voice low but cold. Daniels opened his mouth, but no words came out. "You arrested a decorated army soldier, without cause. You didn't verify his identity. And worse, you treated him with blatant disrespect," Miller continued, his voice rising. "Do you understand what this means? For you? For this department?" Daniels swallowed hard. "I thought, no, that's your problem," Miller snapped. "You didn't think. You acted on prejudice. And now we're all going to pay for it." Miller slammed a report onto the desk. "I've already had calls from the Army and the Mayor's office. This isn't going away quietly. You're suspended, effective immediately, pending a full investigation." Daniel's face went pale. "Suspended. But nothing." Miller cut him off. "If it were up to me, you'd already be fired." Meanwhile, James had returned to his hotel, where he began drafting an official complaint. Every detail of the encounter, every word Daniels had spoken, was documented with military precision. But he wasn't stopping there. The next morning, he reached out to a trusted friend, Monica Hughes, an attorney specializing in civil rights cases. Monica was sharp, relentless, and as passionate about justice as James was. "This is exactly the kind of case we need to highlight," Monica said, after James recounted the incident. "It's not just about you. It's about holding people like this accountable. Let me handle the legal side, but I'd recommend sharing your story. People need to see this for what it is." James hesitated. He had always been a private man, someone who believed in actions more than words. But this wasn't just about him anymore. "Do it," he said finally. "Let's make sure no one else has to go through this." Within days, James's story was everywhere. A social media post detailing the arrest, paired with a photo of his military ID and a dignified portrait of him in uniform, went viral. The hashtag #JusticeForJames started trending, drawing attention from news outlets and sparking conversations about systemic racism in law enforcement. Interviews followed. James's calm demeanor and powerful words resonated with viewers. "I fought for this country because I believed in its ideals," he said during one broadcast. "But moments like this make me question who those ideals are really for. This isn't just about me. It's about every person who's been treated as less than because of the color of their skin." The precinct became a lightning rod for controversy. Protesters gathered outside, demanding accountability. Daniels's suspension became a public spectacle, and calls for his termination grew louder with each passing day. Inside the precinct, Officers began to distance themselves from Daniels. His once cocky attitude was replaced with quiet desperation. He couldn't escape the whispers or the condemning stares of his colleagues. One evening, Daniels sat in his small, dimly lit apartment, scrolling through the endless headlines. Each article, each comment, was a reminder of his actions and the ripple effect they had caused. For the first time, he began to question himself, not out of guilt, but because his world was crumbling. He stared at a video of James speaking at a community event, surrounded by veterans and activists. The soldier's voice was steady, his words piercing. Racism isn't just about hatred, it's about ignorance, and it's about silence. We can't stay silent anymore. Daniel shut his laptop and buried his face in his hands. For the first time, the weight of his choices began to sink in. James Carter never intended to become the face of a movement, but as his story spread, it became more than just a tale of personal injustice. It ignited a wave of activism. Across the country, people shared their own encounters with racial profiling and police misconduct. Hashtags like #JusticeForJames and #EndRacismInBlue flooded social media, uniting voices that demanded change. James, though humbled by the overwhelming support, remained focused on the mission. "This isn't about me," he said during an interview with a major news network. "It's about making sure no one else has to endure what I did. It's about fixing a system that lets people like Officer Daniels think they can act without consequences." He wasn't just speaking, he was acting. Monica Hughes, James's civil rights attorney, worked tirelessly alongside him to draft a legal case against Daniels and the precinct. But James knew that legal battles, while necessary, were only part of the solution. Real change required education, accountability, and systemic reform. Using the momentum of his story, James reached out to advocacy groups and veterans organizations. Together, they launched a campaign aimed at combating racism in law enforcement, with a focus on bias training, accountability measures, and stronger community oversight. "Racism thrives in silence," James said during a rally in his hometown. "But when we shine a light on it, when we hold it accountable, it loses its power." His words, backed by his military service and his calm but resolute demeanor, struck a chord with audiences everywhere. Inside the Braxton precinct, Captain Miller faced mounting pressure. Community leaders demanded answers, and higher-ups in law enforcement weren't pleased with the black eye the department had received. Investigations into Daniels's history revealed a troubling pattern of misconduct, racially charged comments, excessive force complaints, and a history of skirting disciplinary actions. "How did we let it get this far?" Miller muttered during a meeting with senior officers. The answer was simple: complacency. And now, the precinct was paying the price. Daniels, still suspended and isolated from his peers, found himself cornered. Protesters gathered outside his apartment, and his phone rang non-stop with calls from journalists and critics. He avoided the news, but couldn't escape the growing sense that his career and reputation were over. James wasn't interested in vengeance, he wanted accountability. But he also believed in the possibility of change. During one of his public appearances, a journalist asked him, "What do you hope happens to Officer Daniels?" James paused, considering his answer carefully. "I hope he learns," he said. "I hope he takes a hard look at the choices he's made and understands the harm he's caused. Not just to me, but to the community he's supposed to serve. Change isn't easy, but it's necessary." Those words reached Daniels in a way nothing else had. Late one night, he replayed the clip, hearing James's steady voice over and over. For the first time, the walls of his defensiveness began to crack. The ripple effect of James's story reached Braxton itself. Town meetings became standing-room-only events where citizens demanded reforms. The mayor announced a review of the police department's policies, and a task force was formed to address racial bias and accountability. At the same time, James worked closely with local leaders to ensure the changes weren't just surface level. He attended meetings, spoke to young recruits, and shared his story with schools and civic groups. One day, as James walked out of a community center after speaking to a group of high school students, A young black boy ran up to him. "Are you the soldier from the news?" the boy asked, his wide eyes filled with admiration. James crouched down to meet his gaze. "I am," he said with a smile. The boy hesitated, then said, "My dad says people like you make it better for us. Thank you." James's throat tightened. "It's not just me," he said softly. "It's all of us, working together." Meanwhile, Daniels couldn't ignore the weight of his actions. With the investigation against him moving swiftly, he finally reached out to Captain Miller. "I need to talk to Sergeant Carter," Daniels said, his voice hesitant but sincere. Miller frowned but agreed to set up a meeting. "This won't be easy for you, Daniels, but it's a start." When the day came, Daniels sat across from James in a quiet conference room. The air was thick with tension, but James's calm, steady demeanor made Daniels feel smaller than ever. "I wanted to say, I was wrong," Daniels began, struggling with the words. "I let my prejudices cloud my judgment. I treated you like you didn't matter. And for that, I'm sorry." James studied him for a long moment before responding. "Apologies are a start," he said. "But what matters is what you do next. Are you ready to be better? To be part of the solution?" Daniels nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. "I want to try." The meeting between James and Daniels became a turning point. Not just for the two men, but for the town of Braxton itself. For James, it was a step toward holding individuals accountable while demonstrating the power of forgiveness. For Daniels, it was a harsh mirror reflecting the man he had been and the man he needed to become. Daniels wasn't immediately welcomed back into the precinct. Even after his suspension ended, he returned to a department that no longer looked at him with respect. His colleagues kept their distance, the public glared at him, and his once unshakable confidence was replaced by doubt. But the memory of James's words lingered in his mind. What matters is what you do next. Daniels began attending the racial bias and de-escalation training sessions that the department had implemented as part of its reforms. At first, he resented being there, feeling singled out. But as he listened to the trainers and the stories of community members who shared their experiences, something shifted. He started to see beyond his narrow worldview, realizing how deeply ingrained biases had shaped his actions and harmed others. One afternoon, Daniel stood up during a training session, his voice hesitant but determined. "I want to do better," he said. "I want to understand what I've been blind to." It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was genuine. For Daniels, it was the first step toward change. While Daniels worked on himself, James remained a tireless advocate for justice. He traveled to cities across the country, sharing his story with police departments, community leaders, and activists. His message was always the same. Change is possible, but it requires effort from all of us. In Braxton, the reforms he had pushed for began to take shape. The task force established oversight committees that included civilians, ensuring transparency in police operations. New officers underwent rigorous training to combat implicit bias, and seasoned officers were held to higher standards of accountability. James didn't just oversee these changes from a distance. He immersed himself in the process. He joined community policing initiatives, walked the streets with officers, and encouraged open dialogue between law enforcement and the people they served. At one meeting, a young officer approached James after his talk. "I joined the force to make a difference," she said. "Hearing your story reminded me why I'm here." James smiled, his voice warm but firm. "Then make sure every choice you make honors that reason." James's efforts extended far beyond Braxton. His advocacy inspired similar reforms in neighboring towns, and even drew the attention of lawmakers at the state level. Policies began to shift, and funding was allocated for programs that emphasized community engagement and mental health resources over aggressive policing. But the most profound impact was on the people. Stories poured in from individuals who had faced similar injustices, thanking James for using his platform to amplify their voices. One letter, written by a young black boy, stood out to James. It read, "Dear Mr. Carter, my dad says you're a hero because you're fighting for people like us. I want to be brave like you when I grow up. Thank you for helping us feel like we matter. James held the letter for a long time, his heart heavy with both gratitude and responsibility. Months later, Daniels reached out to James again. This time, it wasn't to apologize. It was to ask for guidance. I've been trying to do better, Daniels said, his voice earnest. But I want to understand more. How can I help fix what I've broken? James considered him carefully. He had seen men like Daniels before, men who could talk a good game but lacked the conviction to follow through. But this time, he saw something different. If you're serious, James said, start by listening. Go to the community. Hear their stories. Let their pain teach you what your privilege has shielded you from. And when you're ready, take action. Not for your image, but because it's the right thing to do. Daniels nodded, his expression resolute. I'll do it. Over time, Daniels became an unlikely ally in the fight for reform. He joined community events, worked with advocacy groups, and spoke openly about his past mistakes. At first, his presence was met with skepticism and anger, but as he continued to show up, not to defend himself but to learn, minds began to change. During one town hall, Daniels addressed the crowd, his voice steady but humble. I was part of the problem, he admitted, but I'm committed to being part of the solution, and I know I have a long way to go. In the audience, James watched quietly. He didn't clap or cheer. He simply nodded. Redemption, he knew, wasn't about words. It was about action. Years later, James's work had transformed Braxton into a model of police reform. Daniels had become a respected figure in the community, not because he was perfect, but because he had faced his flaws and worked tirelessly to overcome them. As James walked through the streets of Braxton one evening, he passed by the same diner where it had all begun. The memories flooded back. The heat of that day, the weight of the cuffs, the sting of humiliation. But now the diner's parking lot was full of laughter and conversation. Officers sat with community members, sharing meals and stories. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. James smiled, the sunset casting a warm glow on the town. This wasn't just his victory, it was everyone's. James Carter's story wasn't just about one man's fight against injustice. It was a testament to the power of resilience, the necessity of accountability, and the belief that even those who've made mistakes can find redemption if they're willing to change.